Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind, episode 121.
And education's also always, in a free society, it's always been about sacrifice. And sacrifice is an amazing catalyst to progress.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Stephen Adams. Stephen holds a degree in business and education with a PhD in foundations of education from Florida State University. He has taught and directed private and virtual schools in Idaho and Utah. He has also started businesses supporting the startup and operation of choice schools. He has served as the director of charter, virtual, and home education for the Florida Department of Education and is currently working with BYU as the director of research and evaluations for the Pathway programs. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves and lives in Sugar City with his wife and 7 children. Stephen has also been a past guest on The Luminous Mind as episode number 64, where we discussed his intriguing dissertation entitled Liberty of Conscience and Mass Schooling. Well, welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Pleasure to talk to you again.
Yeah, Stephen is definitely, I've mentioned before, he's a good friend of mine. We go back kind of a long way. And we had a mutual friend that told me that he did a really great presentation on the history of education. And I figured if we want to change the paradigm of education, we need to understand the origins of that as well as the direction that it's going to take our students. So I guess I'll just kind of turn the time over to you. And if you want to start with the beginning, that'd be great.
Well, you know, Rebecca, when you talked to me about this subject, I went back and I just kind of outlined a couple of things. And one of them was why we study history. When I entered my master's program at Florida State University, the gentleman who accepted me into his program and became the chair of my dissertation committee sat me down and basically tried to talk me out of studying history and philosophy of education because there weren't any jobs in it. And I kept telling him I already had a job, I was good, I just wanted to study and learn. And eventually he finally relented and let me pursue my studies. But it is kind of sad in our society. It is hard for people who've studied history and philosophy and actually understand where things came from, why we do what we do now, to have a voice. I think one of the most important reasons we study history is just simply to understand where we came from and how we got what we got. Exactly. And then once we understand it, we can ask questions. Were those good choices along the way? Could we have made a different choice with a different outcome? And a lot of times we just kind of take what we have as the only option. Like we look around in our society at education and we say, well, we have these centralized school systems. Each state kind of has their own system. They have school districts. Those school districts are locally controlled by a school board, hypothetically. And that's the system we have. Therefore, it must be a good system. But at the same time, if you go back into history and you look at the arguments around the establishment of that system, you will see that there was a huge debate in society about whether we should have a centralized system or a diverse system. And it was a very valid debate. There were a lot of good opinions on both sides. So we need to, at a minimum, go back, look at what happened, and ask ourselves, was this creation of a centralized kind of a monolithic school system a good idea?
Well, and we did have some founders, such as Thomas Jefferson, that were kind of lobbying for a public, like a school system. Isn't that correct? I mean, that's what we always hear whenever we give opposition to public schools, is that, you know, this was an intention of our founders to eventually have public school because Thomas Jefferson and some of those other founders talked about wanting free schools.
Yeah, multiple sides of this debate are guilty of trying to go find founder quotes and say that those quotes support our position. And, you know, Jefferson did support public education, and as well as Washington and other founders. But public education in the Jeffersonian kind of model does not resemble what we have today. And anybody who's studied his writings and what he was arguing for, we do not have Jeffersonian public education. So there's a huge difference between common schooling and public education. So that's something I'm happy to get into as we go along. But in order for the public to fund education, it does not have to be uniform and the exact same common system for everyone.
Like kind of under a central bureaucracy, right?
Well, and Jefferson was a huge proponent of religious freedom. And another manifestation of religious freedom is what I refer to, well, it's not just I, but what's referred to as liberty of conscience. If Jefferson truly believed in those things, there is no way that a common school system, a centrally controlled, uniform school system, can live in coexistence with liberty of conscience, freedom of religion. Those things cannot coexist. So there is no way that the current system we have now is something that was in harmony with Jefferson's feelings about public education. He saw a public education system that was kind of a meritocracy, where students would filter through a progressively more restrictive system until those most brilliant students were able to be at the top at public universities. And there's a lot of good ideas in what he's saying. Another problem with citing Jefferson or any other founder is that some of these founders were very open to new ideas. They would be ashamed, in my opinion, especially Jefferson, would be ashamed of people using their arguments at one point in time to say that we shouldn't reconsider those kind of ideas over time as new evidence manifests itself. So to say that Jefferson would right now jump into society and say, oh, I love our common schooling system, it's just wonderful, it's exactly what I envisioned for a meritocracy, is pretty shaky.
Well, and why don't we talk about kind of starting from the roots? I mean, before we had public education, and one of the big arguments is if we didn't have public education, most of the society would be illiterate. What did the education look like before we started in on our public school system?
A long time ago, one of the things that got me interested in history and philosophy of education was a book called Are Public Schools Necessary? And that book actually addresses those specific arguments very well, because when the choice movement kind of started having a beginning and homeschooling was becoming fairly popular, those questions were thrown out there like, won't society just fall apart if we do something different? Which is a huge assumption and is based in this idea that what we have now is just so brilliant that nothing else could possibly work. Well, there was education before common schooling. There were schools before common schooling, and they worked well. We had a very well-educated society. If you compare the American colonial and early United States society to other countries, we were very literate. We had excellent education in this country, and it was all without common schooling.
Some people say, though, that only the rich had access to that education. I mean, some of our founders weren't even, they were educated at home and self-educated. So is that true? Was it only the rich that were able to go to schools?
No. This book, if I remember right, it looked at Pennsylvania a little bit, and it talked about how actually before the implementation of the common public schools, there were actually fewer students out of school. And there were always charitable schools. There were always options for people. I'm not saying that they were all wonderful options, but our options right now under public education are not wonderful. We're comparing our situation now to a very different economy, a very different type of life. And while it's true that not everyone had access to high quality education, that's true today. And It's a shame today because we have a much better economy, much better resources, much less expensive educational systems if we choose to use them. I mean, we're not comparing apples to apples, but back then there were many options, especially in your established communities, for education for the poor. And education's also always, in a free society, it's always been about sacrifice. And sacrifice is an amazing catalyst to progress. We can't just answer those things all or nothing. But there were great options before there was a common school system, and the common schooling argument had much more to do about control, cultural control, than it did about helping the poor.
Let's kind of go back, I guess, and discuss like the Jeffersonian idea of public education. And you said that also George Washington supported a common education too. Do you want to give us kind of a background of maybe what their thoughts were and what you feel like that their vision was?
Well, let me go back a step further and then remind me, and I'll talk on that a little bit. I'm not an expert on Jefferson's educational beliefs. I've read through them, nor am I on Washington's. I just know that I've read some things from Washington where he talked about a national university that would be a government school. So I can address that a little bit. But let's take a step back and let's look at what education was. And to understand Jefferson, you have to understand Virginia a little bit. So Virginia, as a colony, had an established religion. The religion was funded through taxes. The schools were provided by the religion. It was an established religious colony, and that continued under the Constitution. So the Constitution requiring this separation of church and state was only at the federal level. There was still this relationship in many of the states where they had established religions. And that wasn't the constitutional amendment barring the combination of church and state was not applied to the states until after the Civil War. So you had this going on, but a lot of people didn't like it, including Jefferson. Jefferson had argued for years and years with Madison as one of his best supporters that Virginia should not have an established religion. You have this issue where the schools were being run by the state's established religion. Now, that was not the case in all colonies. Other colonies had a diversity of schooling, where the different religious communities would have their own schools, their own systems. There would be different charitable schools set up. And so in the colonies, you had kind of two models. You had the established state model, and you had a diversity model. And every colony was different, and some more towards the established model and some more towards the diversity model, and there's kind of a continuum there. And that lasted until we had the common school movement. Well, and the states began to drop their established religions. So Jefferson and Madison finally won their argument in Virginia. The other states dropped their established religions, and they became more of a diversity model. What this allowed for was a huge influx of immigrants, and many of those immigrants were Catholic. And these Catholic communities began to set up Catholic schools. And they began to be not just a religious nuisance to the majority religions, but they began to become a political threat to these established religions. And so you have a political battle between kind of these two sides start to form between Protestant Christianity and Catholicism. And the Protestant Christians fought for control of the education dollars in the public school systems. And there were many different systems. So in New York, you had several different religions operating public schools or schools with public funds. When this battle happened, you end up with the result after the battle is the majority Protestant Christians formed a kind of a loosely held coalition of different Protestant groups getting together, creating kind of a generic Protestant Christianity, one that they could form a political majority around. And this government-defined, majority-defined Protestant Christianity became a new quasi-state established religion using the public school system to ensure its survival. And one of their express goals was to do away with Catholicism by not allowing Catholic children to be educated in Catholic doctrines. It's not this big, innocent, wonderful, romantic past of public education where people got together and decided, wow, we got to help the poor. Let's create a uniform, high-quality public schooling system. That's utter nonsense if you look at the actual political history of how common schooling was created. The public arguments, the arguments in the newspapers, the arguments for common schooling were anti-Catholic and actually anti-Mormon arguments. And they threw Mormons in. They were a much smaller group than the Catholics, but they were so poorly looked upon by the majority of society that if they could equate the Catholics to the Mormons, then they had this huge political leverage against the Catholics. So you have the old saying about the twin pillars of barbarism, Catholicism and Mormonism, and that whole anti-Catholic rhetoric was the fuel that created the common schooling movement in this country.
Well, and this was happening like early 1800s, right?
Correct.
So our nation had 30, 40, 50 years of private schooling and lots of homeschooling. You were talking about in some of these states that there were publicly funded schools. Was that done through forced taxation and stuff, or how was that brought about? Okay. So like a state tax.
And some of those through established churches.
And then, our school systems used to just be ran by the state. I mean, now we have a U.S. Department of Education. How did each state go about starting to adopt some of these compulsory type schools?
That is the common school movement, and that is the movement that was fueled by the anti-Catholic rhetoric. And people won't see this in our history books because we don't teach it in foundations of education classes when we're training up public educators. We just choose to romanticize it and gloss over what actually created our common school system. It was religious bigotry that created the system we currently have. But they'll go back and they'll say, well, it was to make sure that all the poor were being... And those arguments, you can find them out there. They, the whereases and the bills that were passed to create these common schools would cite that kind of stuff. But the actual political rhetoric that was banding people together and building the political coalition to get the bill passed was the anti-Catholic rhetoric. So, yes, there were published purposes for the common schooling, which was to make sure that all the poor are well educated, to provide for the liberal education necessary to support a free people, which is something that Jefferson truly supported. Those were arguments being made, but if we look at the actual result of public education over time, that never happened. We have never had high-quality education for all people. We have never, in our public school system, after common schooling, we've never had a liberal education where we're actually teaching the arts of a free people, which is what liberal arts are all about. Those things have never happened. So if we judge public education in the common school era based on their own stated objectives, we have failed miserably in public education. But if we judge it from the criteria of, are we controlling society's culture? Are we controlling what people believe, what they think? Then we've had huge success in public schooling, which was the actual purpose of public education in trying to do away with minority cultures, minority ways of thinking like Catholicism and Mormonism.
Wow. Well, and wouldn't some people, and we kind of talked about this, I guess, during our last podcast, that some people might feel like common objectives is a good thing for society so that we're all kind of, understanding where each other are coming from. But what is your take on that? Does that really help our societies when we don't have, this common understanding, common knowledge?
Well, I think there are a lot of assumptions being built into that argument. One is that somehow having common objectives produces common outcomes, which is not true because there are a lot of different methods of funding, different ways of doing things. But I don't really care much for that refutation of the argument. I want to go back to what is a free society. And in a free society, you do need to have some kind of basis for social association, or you end up with a great deal of social upheaval. But that does not have to be uniform, compulsory education where only one way of thinking or only one system of beliefs about what is right and what is wrong is acceptable. Now, in a free society, we should be able to choose what we want to believe. Now, we can call that freedom of religion. We can call it liberty of conscience. But the basic idea is, are we free to choose what we want to think, what we want to do, and what we want to believe? And if we truly are a free society, we cannot have uniform educational outcomes for everyone. Because how that is done in a democratic system is the majority will select those outcomes, and force them upon the various minority groups. And that is not freedom. That is the exact opposite. It is the tyranny of the majority over the minorities.
Yeah. Well, and if we go back to kind of what we talked about before of Jefferson and Washington's ideas, what I've studied with Jefferson is he wanted like a basic education of learning how to read and kind of simple math, kind of just what you would get in maybe grade school. He didn't necessarily foresee 12 years or 13 years of education. Is that correct? Or, I mean, let's kind of go back to some of those founders' ideas.
It is. And one reason I haven't studied a whole lot of that is that times are very, very different now than they were then. I don't want to return to an educational system where the majority of people only learn basic math. Well, I shouldn't say majority, because the majority of the people actually could read and write better than we do today, most likely. There's differing studies on that. But I'm not sure that's what I want. What I want is for each social group to be able to make their own decisions about what they want to pursue and what their goals are. I think everyone should be well educated, should know how to read and write well. I think everyone should know how to calculate. You go back to some of the things Jefferson was reading, the ancient Greek society, the very term liberty came from liber. Liber is the same root for library. It actually comes from a term that was the name for paper. So those citizens who could read and write and calculate, those were the free class. Those were the liber class. And they created libraries, and that was the foundation for liberty. So this whole concept of the liberal arts, the arts of a free people, come from the ability to read, write, and calculate. So yes, everyone basically agrees that those should be our base standards. But then we start just abusing that concept with all these different political agendas and who wants what for kids and what's best for kids and what's best for teachers and all this political garbage that clouds the issue, when all we need to do is leave it up to individual free citizens to decide what kind of education do I want for our child. And then in a free society, we have a democratic discourse where different groups can observe each other, talk about their results, not in some kind of a forceful majority vote political system, but in just an open public dialogue so that each different group of schools can make their own decisions and decide what new methods do we want to adopt, what's working well for these other groups that we want to see in our own systems, and we leave it up to free choice. I mean, that is not something there is no evidence of. There was much more freedom in this country in education before the establishment of a centralized uniform common school system.
Before we go on, let us take a minute and hear about our sponsors. Changing a paradigm takes some study, but like me, you are probably super busy. That's why we've teamed up with Audible. Go to our website, theluminousmind.net. Get a free month of Audible with 2 audiobooks, thousands of titles in exchange for only books that you absolutely love. You too can be learning on the go to keep that fire burning. Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Stephen Adams. Well, and some people might say that the majority did choose because the majority of children go to, these public education versus a private school that is religiously founded. Why do you think that nowadays most children go to the public schooling and that the private schooling isn't flourishing?
Well, I think private schooling does flourish in certain areas and changes over time. Homeschooling is one term of private schooling, and it has flourished over the last 20 years, has become a huge part of our educational offerings in this country. But there are problems for that. Education requires, even in its most inexpensive forms, education requires part of the economic support. And when you have a society that has said, we're going to forcibly remove a certain part of the economic produce from a community, and we're going to create these free common public schools, you've then disadvantaged every group that wants a different kind of school system. And this happened, there's two groups historically that are really good examples of this. One is the freed black slaves in the South after the Civil War, where they were told, oh, sure, you can start your own schools, but by the way, part of your income has to be removed to pay for these white privileged schools, and then you can do your own schooling after that. Another group that was impacted by that is the Catholics. So you have this creation of the Protestant majority-controlled public schools, and then the Catholics are told, oh, you have access to these free schools, but your children are going to have to read from a Bible that you don't agree with. They're going to have to pray in ways that you don't agree with. But, oh, you're still free to have your own school system. Now you're just going to have to pay for education twice.
Yeah.
And a term that kind of came into popularity to describe that is double taxation, where you're taxed once to provide a public good, is what they call it. And then you have to provide that good again on your own. And it puts you as a class of people in a disadvantaged state economically and in a delegitimized state because you're not a part of that which is normal and acceptable. And those are both incredibly problematic if you're trying to respect liberty of conscience and freedom in a society.
Yeah, that's exactly the direction I was hoping that you're planning on going, because that is true. I mean, that's why a lot of people, even though they may be frustrated with the local school, when they talk about doing education somewhere else, they just can't afford to do that. They just don't have the resources available. So the other question that I have, though, too, is most of our public schools before, the 1970s, I think, were locally controlled. And a lot of those religious communities had a lot more input. And what was the reasoning for the creation of the U.S. Department of Ed, and how does that affect our schooling?
Well, trying to figure out why the U.S. Department of Ed was created and all the intricacies of that is too complicated for me. I do think that it's pretty clear that that was an argument about social control again, and not about what's best. So there's a huge push in that era for science and math education because we were afraid that we were falling behind in the sciences, and so there was a huge amount of federal dollars that were put into that, and then the states and the local communities had to buy into that concept in order to get that tax money back into their communities. So that was a big part of it, but it was always unconstitutional from the very beginning. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that authorizes education at the national level. Washington did not win that argument for a national university, and there was no other nationalized education allowed anywhere. And that was just a huge mistake. It never should have happened. So I hope that answers that question. And then I would like to address this myth of local control. It comes from, well, now it's a myth. I mean, there is very little local control. You talk to any school board, and all they're doing all the time is trying to find ways to implement the stuff the state and the feds are telling them to do.
Yeah.
They're not actually making any independent decisions about schooling and how to best serve the youth in their community. They're just trying to find ways to either minimize negative impacts forced upon them or implement programs that were forced upon them.
They're basically just picking fluffy stuff, like colors of seats or desks or stuff, right?
Well, yeah, and then some local initiative or something where they're going to have, a school assembly twice a year to talk about some in vogue cultural concept, and somehow that's freedom in education. It's rather silly what kind of ability they have. But I want to go back to even the romanticized period in public education. So I think there's two different problems we need to look at in the way we look at the past in education. One is this romanticized notion that we used to have Christian public schools, and that was the good times. That's when things were the way they were supposed to be.
When we could pray in schools and stuff, right?
Right. We could always pray in schools before we ever had public schools, before common schooling. They always prayed in schools. The only schools in the early colonial era were religious schools. Everything was religious. But this idea that somehow when we created these centralized common schools with the express purpose of destroying the Catholic culture in our society, that was the best of us as an American people is ludicrous. That is not an appropriate origin for a schooling system. It was a travesty in this country, and it's something we should all be ashamed of, especially those of us that are Christian and, may have benefited from that inappropriate turn in our society. It's not something we should be proud of. It's not something we should be excited about returning to. We should not want to force our idea of religion on everyone else in our society. That is not what this country was founded upon, and it was not an appropriate turn when we adopted Protestant public schools. The other one that I have a real problem with is the idea that, well, when the local school board actually controlled education in our local community, that was the right way to do it. Well, the problem with that is that liberty of conscience doesn't just exist at a state level or at a national level. It has to exist at an individual. So the basic problem is if you have a state level centralized system, then you have the majority of people in that state determining how monies are going to be collected from everybody and what is going to be taught for everybody. That is not consistent with freedom. And then if you take that to the local level, it's less bad, I would argue, because you're getting closer to the people and you're probably going to have a more cohesive group, especially in the founding era. Communities were very cohesive, culturally, religiously, but nowadays that's just not the case. To say that if we gave a local school board autonomy and control, that would be an appropriate system is not true, because we're still collecting money through taxation. We're forcing people to pay for something, and there will always be minorities in each community that are excluded from the system or forced to change their ideals to fit into the system, or whose children will be altered without parental and family and cultural appropriate inputs by the government at the local level controlling their education. It's probably a better problem to keep it local at the school district level, but it is still the same problem. You have a government educating people all to one uniform ideal, and it is the best form of tyranny anybody could ever design. Uniform government education.
Well, and our founding wasn't necessarily to be a democracy. I hear that a lot, in our recent local school thing here. There was a bond posted for a new school, and that was what we were hearing all the time. This is a democracy and the majority decides. But like you said, there's always that minority that's always being excluded, and that's not necessarily what our founders wanted. Is that correct? I mean, that we had this democracy where you could take away from these small minorities basically for their own good is another thing I've heard.
Yeah. I was teaching a class the other day, and I said, we argue today about, libertarianism versus conservatism versus the dramatically wrongly labeled liberal culture. What we have today that's termed liberal has nothing to do with actual liberty and the whole concept of the liberal arts back in the early days. But so we have these different arguments about who's right and who's wrong. Well, you go back to the founding era, and the arguments are well represented in two publications. One's called the Federalist Papers, and one's called the Anti-Federalist Papers. So the Federalist Papers were supporting the new Constitution and a centralized federal government. And the Anti-Federalist Papers, they weren't supporting communism. They weren't supporting socialism. They were supporting even more libertarian concepts than the Federalist Papers. So the argument was it hadn't even gotten into the conservative or not even close to what we would call the liberal arena. They were arguing in the far extremes of libertarianism on both sides.
Almost in an anarch type area. Is that?
And one group was close to approaching anarchy, and that would be more represented in the Anti-Federalist Papers. And then you had the Federalist Papers leaning away from anarchy, saying, no, we have to have more of what John Locke would have argued for in his second treatise on civil government. We have to have some kind of a governmental structure to protect individual rights, but not to create harmonies, not to do all this stuff that we think governments are intended to do nowadays, like provide for people and make sure we all have equal things and that we all are given equal opportunities. That was never the intention. the whole purpose of government was to protect individual rights.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's totally lost to our society.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me kind of bring that full circle, hopefully making it somewhat meaningful to people. What we ended up with was this anti-Catholic centralized public schooling system. Over time, the political majority changed. And not only is our public system now anti-Catholic, but it's also anti-Protestant. So the system turned against its own parents. So, the Protestant coalition of the majority created the system, and the system turned on them when they were no longer the majority. And so we have a public centralized system now that is expressly anti-religious, period. So that is a huge problem.
So when we end up with atheist children, we shouldn't be surprised, correct?
No, that's what we're educating them to be. And we're saying, oh, well, it's okay. You can study religion in your home. You can leave campus and go over to another building and have some kind of release time or early morning religious devotional. But real knowledge, real learning, the kind that's respectable and acceptable to society, that's going to happen in our government schools.
Yeah.
They're seen as delegitimized. And the knowledge they're gaining isn't real knowledge. It's delegitimate. And it's a very real thing. So you end up with lots of problems, which I won't get into. But that is a huge problem in our society where religious knowledge is seen as not real knowledge. The only kind of knowledge is this kind of bastardized scientific knowledge that is only the kind of science we're going to agree with and only the kind of science that's funded through government grants and acceptable to this larger community that's not just scientific, it's very political, very ideological. So it's a huge problem right now. And that's manifest in all of our lives. If we send our kids to the government schools, we see that all the time if you care to pay attention. My daughter found some things in the new Idaho testing that were just incredibly inappropriate. Things that were anti-Bill of Rights, just total garbage that was in that system. And probably still is there. So that's a real problem. Now, there are some possible solutions that are out there being kicked around. One of them is allow a true diversity in our public educational system. You see a move towards that in your charter schools. You see a stronger move in voucher systems and scholarship programs where parents are able to take those tax dollars and spend them as they see fit. There are problems with those systems as well, as the majority continues to try to hold control and say, well, you can have a charter school, but you can only teach to the state common standards. You can have a voucher system, but only if it's non-religious and only if you're evaluated based on the state standard system. Those are problematic. But there are ways to introduce freedom back into our systems. It just requires people to be knowledgeable and to fight for it.
Yeah. And that's what I love about the homeschooling community is I think a lot of us, like you said, when we grew up in the public school system, we had parents that didn't question it. We had just the whole society wasn't questioning it. But I think that's what I really love about the homeschooling movement. And one thing that I've definitely tried to cater towards is changing that paradigm of what we think about education and studying the history and, like you said, seeing where they wanted it and where it's taken us and all of those things. What would you recommend to study if our parents are interested in that?
When I published my dissertation, I made it available to the public just because I wanted to get that information out there, and there are several books referenced in my dissertation. So if people want to do a search for Stephen Adams, Florida State University, doctoral dissertation, liberty of conscience, and mass schooling, that's a place to start, and they can go right to the works cited in the back of it, and they can start working through things. A lot of those books are from people who would be termed as liberal right now in our society, and several of them from conservative and religious people. In fact, I even quote from a couple of communists in that work, because some of these concepts are seen in all those communities. The idea of allowing people to choose what's best for them is more universal than what we might think it is. So I'd start there. If it just depends on, what community you're in and what's important to you and which of those books are going to speak the best to you. The one I mentioned at the beginning is a great one if you're just getting started. Is public education necessary? Just to help kind of break you of this romanticized notion of common schooling as some kind of a social panacea that will cure all of our problems.
Okay, great. Well, and I linked it before for your dissertation, but I'll link it again and see if I can find that and definitely include it. So for
great. People who actually get interested and download that, don't feel like you have to read the whole thing. Just look at some of it's really tedious. Just read the parts that are of interest to you, and maybe the last couple of chapters probably give you the essence of it. But a lot of the references sometimes are the best part.
Great. Well, and before we say goodbye, do you have just any final words on what we've discussed today? And then definitely, give us your contact information, how people could get in touch with you if they wanted to know, more information about you.
What I think is most important about education is that we all allow each other to be free. Allow each other to pursue our own goals and our own values in a free society. If we want that freedom ourselves, we've got to allow it of others with kind of this baseline that, that freedom can't begin to impinge on the freedom of others. So, people have told me before, well, what you're saying means that we're going to end up with these, Islamic schools that are going to teach genocide of Christianity. And it's just not true, because in a free society, the role of government is to protect the rights of everyone. And so that won't happen. But there will be freedom, and there will be the opportunity to pursue your ideas and your values on your own. And that's what I believe is the most important. I'm not into an argument about what produces the best math scores, what produces the best reading scores. I want to talk about what produces a free society and what can maintain freedom over generations. And education can do that, but only if it's education for a free society, in a free society, which we do not have now. So that's kind of what I believe in the most. And if people want to find me, they can find me. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn, just Stephen Adams. And if they are looking for me, I don't work at BYU. I work at BYU, Idaho. That might help them in their search.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Steve. It's been great having you again.
Hey, thanks for having me. Anytime. We'll see you around.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Stephen Adams, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list and consider joining our program by going to the scheduling tab to become a fire starter today. Help support the podcast by making all your Amazon purchases through the free Amazon widget on our website. Also, sign up to receive 2 free audiobooks from Audible at theluminousmind.net. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Google+, and now Pinterest. Get our audio content by subscribing on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider telling your friends about us. Leave us a review. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education